The Watershed Tour, the 1949 All Blacks in Southern Africa. Written by my friend David McLennan right here in sunny Cape Town. I think this book works on two levels. One is the sports and sports history level. I think any aficionado of sport and sport history, any rugby fan, will immediately appreciate this. This book catalogues this tour, the All Blacks in, as the title says, Southern Africa, not just South Africa. A long tour as they were back in the day. And it goes well beyond just the sport. It goes into the personalities, the cultural impact of this tour. And also contains things like rare photos of a try or not a try, depending on how you look at it, that saved or didn't save a test match in the dying moments. So any rugby aficionado, my suggestion is that if you go off to a braai with your mates and one of them has read this book and you haven't, your credentials as a rugby man will be thoroughly set back. Now the second level, to me, is more interesting. And it's one that, in my case, emerged as I read it. I think the modern narrative on the Springboks is one of newness, of breaking molds, and inclusivity. Now, all of those have some validity. All of them are at least in part true. But as I go through this book, I'm looking at a contrast, contrasting that narrative with one that certainly existed at the time of these events. And that's the narrative of tradition, a narrative of exclusivity, a narrative of sameness. And I wonder, to what extent does this still apply? I think one statistic helps us to answer this. Look at the number of schools that produce Springbok rugby players. Now, depending on which stats you look at, it's fair to say that I think almost 1/3 of Springbok rugby players come from a fairly consistent list of 10 schools. You'll also notice that all of those schools are quite old. It also seems that more schools are coming into the mix and producing Springboks, but it remains that, be it 1949 or 2026, there are limited ways to get to the Springboks, and it is extremely hard to do it unless you go to one of quite a small number of schools. Now, these schools are old. They are institutions, and they contain institutions that have been built up over decades and in some cases, centuries. So I think there's quite a contrast between these two narratives. Both are partly true and both are partly false. We're dealing with grey areas here. My suggestion is that this is one of the more important debates that emerges when you read a book like this. And I think it's important to think about this because we can extend this more broadly to South Africa and look at institutions where the modern narrative is one of novelty, change, and inclusivity. The narrative that is somewhat outdated, or at least some would call outdated, is one of exclusivity, oldness, and a lack of change. Sticking to either of these too strictly would, I think, result in failure. But I think too many people are doing this. I think it's very easy to break an institution, not so easy to build one. It's also very hard to be high performing as well as inclusive. In fact, exclusive is very much associated with high performing. The Springboks, to some extent inclusive, in that anyone who's good enough can play for them. Highly exclusive, in that very, very few people will ever play for them. So my suggestion is that the modern prevailing story about the Springboks should be addressed in light of what I've been talking about, the ancient institutions. And while we should change, we should grow, we should progress, there should be scope for inclusivity. Exclusivity is not necessarily a bad thing. It's okay that a small number of schools are the best, that they're the ones able to produce Springboks. Too much inclusivity results in what Gad Saad calls suicidal empathy. And sometimes South Africans err towards that side. So a fantastic book on the level of sports history, thoroughly recommended. And another takeaway from me is some very important lessons about what the Springboks mean and what modern institutions generally mean and how we should treat them. Absolutely, they need to change, but we cannot throw out the baby with the bathwater.